Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Brew Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp, and today Matthew Distefano is on with us on the Spiritual Brew Pub. Matthew, welcome to the podcast.
Hip, hip, hooray. I apologize if I sound stuffed up. I am getting over a cold, but here we
Okay,
are.
well,
The show must go on.
you sound fine. You look fine,
Well, you're too
folks.
kind.
Matthew is an author, a publisher, a podcaster, and actually a Red Sox fan and Boston sports fan. So we have a lot in common. I grew up in Boston, so I was very pleased to hear about that, Matthew. We could
I
tell a lot of stories, I'm sure, about that.
Yeah, we won't bore your listeners though.
No, but if people mutually hate the Yankees, they'll like us. But maybe New York fans, maybe we're turning them off now. But we don't hold that against you. So we're
Not
friends with
not
everyone.
not too much.
Not too much. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Matthew, I've wanted to have you on for a long time, and I wish this was in the evening because I would love to drink a couple brews with you, but it's a little bit too early in the morning for that. So
Well,
we're gonna
that's fine. That's
we're
fine.
going to jump right in and talk about your newest book, Heretic Too. And the subtitle is An LGBTQ Celebrating Divine Violence Denying Post-Christian Universalists' Responses to More of Evangelicalism's Concerns. So that says it all. But we want to kind of learn a little bit about you and your background first, and then talk about why you wrote the book. So maybe you could start off by telling us a Cliff Notes version of your story coming out of evangelicalism.
Well, it was like and unlike so many other stories, right? And I've heard David Hayward say like there's no right way to deconstruct except your way.
Right.
And so in paradoxically, in spite of that truth, there does seem to be a lot of overlap in how these stories tend to go. For me, it did start intellectually, but also emotionally. When I was younger, I had this very strong gravitation to ask deep questions that I didn't find like my peers were asking. Like I was really young when I was thinking about the eternality of hell and, potential salvation of Satan. Why couldn't Satan ask for forgiveness as God if God is so merciful and this and that? Questions I didn't find like other kids asking in my churches.
Right.
So I mean, I'm sure they were, but like it's not like I was articulating these, you know. If people were asking them, I wasn't aware of people asking them because I didn't hear my pastors like talking like this. And so, of course, like as these things happen, like when you get into your early 20s, you start really thinking for yourself. Even in your late teens, um, you start to ask more nuanced questions and more articulate questions, and then you pose them to your pastors. You pose them to your fellow congregants, and the answers you get are just poor. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Very
Like
pat answers. Right.
what's that?
Very pat answers.
Yeah, I just recently talking to my wife about it. Like it seems like when you talk to a lot of these folks, even still, it almost sounds like Chat GPT answers. Like it sounds like
Mm-hmm.
AI. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's picked from a list of answers that you get. It's not someone thinking through them, it's talking points. And I was really interested in philosophy. I studied at university, and that's not how university goes. Like like in your critical reasoning courses, you have to articulate an argument for things you don't agree with. In your debate courses, you have to do those same thing, and you have to be good at defending a point that you don't even agree with. The point is to be good at argumentation.
Right.
And the church is historically, at least in our tradition, like white evangelical tradition, is not good at that. And it fell apart, right? Because I could no longer believe in an errant Bible or hell is forever or the condemnation of the LGBTQ community or the fact that the rapture, that's a big one, and
Right.
down the line. And so then it's like, well, what is my faith then? And so it
Right.
kind of all unraveled for me before I could put it back together in some sort of way. And when I say put it back together, it's super loose, which I think is healthy because then we grasp at things less. Like we hold on to these things less, and that gives us liberation and freedom.
Right. No, absolutely. Well, I like the way you put it, though, is that the questions come out. My experience was the same. I mean, you can ask questions, but they have to be very safe questions, and that you have to pretty much accept their answers. And I found that to be true. If you're not satisfied with their answer, well, then they kind of put it back on you, like, well, you don't have enough faith, or you don't trust
Yeah.
enough,
I
or
love the one that's like, you know
no.
who else asked the first question in the Bible? Like
Yeah.
the devil. Like,
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, so it was kind of like demonizing people who ask too many questions, right?
Mhm.
And you're
Yeah,
like a little troublemaker if you do that. So that's
yeah,
a good reason why I got out too. It's just that things don't add up, and I think people like you and me, we want life to make sense, and most people do. And
well,
when it
yeah,
doesn't make sense, we have questions. So that's perfectly natural.
totally. And things don't line up. I think too many people in the church, they start out, it's like presuppositional theology, right? Like they start with a set of prepositions, with presuppositions, and then they try to fit their experiences back into it rather than leading with their direct experiences and drawing out theologies that are derived, maybe not entirely by your direct experiences, because you want to have a community, you want to take into account history, you want to take into account other things, but it certainly has to start with your direct experiences. And if you believe something that your experiences don't line up with, in the church, it's like we don't then trust our experiences because we trust the
Right.
word of God or we trust the pastor or whatever. And that gets really tenuous.
Yeah, that does get tenuous because the people try to tell you, trust the word of God, trust God. What they're really saying is our interpretation of the word
Of
of
course.
God,
Yeah.
etc.
Mhm.
And then it gets like, well, okay, actually at that point I've got to leave my common sense or my questions at the door and just have faith. And that's when you get into
Yeah.
trouble. So
Yeah.
you've written a couple books that have this title, Heretic, in it. This
Ooh.
is the second one,
Yeah.
and, I was curious, what makes Heretic 2 different than the first one? And, why did you have to come back and write this, second one?
Well, it's the long awaited sequel. I don't know long awaited by whom, but actually, funny story. The first person on, and I always tell the story, the first person on my Heretic launch team, it came out in 2018, said, "Do
Yeah,
not publish this book because it doesn't seem like a book. It seems more like a collection of individual essays that answer individual questions that people have." And I said,
yeah,
"Well, that's literally the title. So that is the premise of the book. Like I took in Heretic, I took 10 questions that I most often, or 10 types of questions, or 10 concerns that evangelicals might have with, you might call my theology at the time progressive theology, or it was heavily influenced by Girard. Um, they have concerns when you have theologies like that, when you say, suggest maybe universalism, or you suggest that maybe God doesn't hate gay people. So I did 10 essays in essence, and then there's always more questions. So I did another 10 in Heretic Too, and I feel like it's as systematic as my theology would ever be, even though I'm not necessarily in the same place all the time. But it's, I think, for what I what I understand, good, healthy, solid theology, Christian theology, I think I put forth a good understanding, kind of like a 30,000 foot view of a bunch of different topics that Christians seem concerned about, especially when they come against more progressive theology, for lack of a better term.
right. Well, there's always more to dig deeper, and
Sure.
there's always new issues, so I appreciate you doing this and covering some of the things that you cover, are really good and important critical things to cover. And so, I mean, we could, that this is the nature of deconstruction. I found this to be true, is that you deconstruct and there are layers. And then after a few years, you realize, I have to go a little bit deeper into this thing that I never did do.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
so that kind of happens. One of the things that was really interesting to me, and I don't know, do you know who Larry Jordan is? He wrote the book The Way, A
Sounds familiar.
Meaningful Spirituality for the Modern World. But he's kind of like, he calls himself a follower of Jesus with a Zen practice.
Uh-huh.
So he's kind of a Zen Buddhist. And then you've got a chapter on that I thought was pretty fascinating. And you're making the case that the way of Jesus is very similar or pretty much the same as the Buddhist way of, and you're going to have to pronounce it for me, the Buddhist way of,
The Bodhisattva.
yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
That word.
Well, sure. Yeah.
So what's your case?
Well, the reason I started with this is in Heretic, the first book, I talk about Jesus. I start with Jesus. Christians like to start with the Bible. I figure if we're going to be Christians, if you are going to be a Christian, you might want to start with Jesus. So I start with Jesus and talk about like what's the point in Jesus? Or is he just our escape hatch? Is he our ticket out of hell? Or is he something else? I've now come to a place where maybe my Jesusology, my Christology, might have changed a little bit, but maybe not so much. But while I do say that culturally and religiously, Judaism is very different than Buddhism, and Jesus's context was very different than the
Right,
Buddha,
right,
um, sociopolitically and everything, that the heart of what they're trying to teach us in what it means to be a true human being living into your full potential looks very much the same. Service of others, humility, um, mercy, and compassion for all living sentient beings,
right,
humans, animals, the planet, treading lightly on the planet, caring for the things around us, living holistically, living communally in service of the others. So the Bodhisattva in the Mahayana tradition would forego the pursuit of their own enlightenment for the sake of benefiting others.
oh, okay.
To
Hmm.
me, that sounds like I came not to be served, but to serve.
Exactly, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Service over
So,
self,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And the reason that it's so important to me is that my best friend, Michael, whom I've written books with, when we were deconstructing, he took that path of Buddhism. He got very into Alan Watts, who also had a similar path of starting in Christianity, and he even went to seminary and then traveled east, as they say. Um, and he introduced me to this, and for me, it's very practical. And in the language of it, while Jesus' language is great too, is super helpful, I think, in approaching the day to day in a calm, meditative way when life can be turbulent, our emotions can be turbulent, and the whole nine.
Right, right. So, I mean, I like the notion because, for me, when I deconstructed, I kind of like rediscovered Jesus again because I realized, wait a minute, we're looking at
Yeah.
Jesus through the lens of fundamentalism, evangelical theology, and there's a Jesus that's not recognized sometimes because sometimes we don't understand the cultural context from which he comes. We look at him through a Western lens, but when we see where he's coming from, we realize he's more Eastern than Western in his viewpoints, etc. And there isn't a lot of overlap with Buddhist teachings, a lot of the mystics through the ages. And if Jesus is a universalist, anointed one who has a message of good news for the whole world. It's not
Mhm.
inclusive. I mean, excuse me, it's not exclusive.
Right.
Then you would think that that's the God behind Jesus would be found all over the world in certain places because
Right.
he's sharing Jesus is sharing a message of universal love all over for every human being. So that makes sense that, lights all over the world and other religions would come out with wisdom teaching that would be similar to to Jesus or even unique.
Yeah, and other, I don't talk about it in the book, but like Baha'i has this idea. I think they're a little more concrete about like every 500 years that figure comes into the earth. Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha. I don't know if I don't think they include Buddha, but they might. But the point being is like literally every 500 years there is that figure. I don't get that literal. I do make the claim that everyone is a bodhisattva, but we just like everyone is in Christ, and that's, I know, a bold claim for some Christians. And that's fine. I think everyone is a bodhisattva, just some don't realize it. They don't live into that potential. Um, we all have the potential to live into our true humanness, and I think that's the point. Like, if you had to, that's one of the major points of Jesus and Buddha,
Yeah.
as I
Yeah.
understand them.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Jesus to me would be like the true human, revealed in the Jewish context in
Yeah,
that part of the world at that
sure.
time.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
right. And as we get close, as if we follow Jesus, we couldn't become more human. We can become more the way we were created to be or made to be.
yeah.
Um, what one of the other things that you addressed was the concept of sin and evangelicalism, and I think that's really uh, critical because so many times uh, fundamentalist Christianity becomes a lot like, a sin management program. You're always looking over your shoulder, wondering if I've sinned, and God hates sin. It's so bad he can't even be in the presence of sinners without Jesus being there or something.
Yeah,
And
sure.
there's all these notions of what sin is in relation to God, etc. And you talk about that in your book. Tell us a little bit about what you say.
Well, I'm sure this is your experience, or in some regard, that we do focus, we hyperfixate on not only sin, but like very specific sins. And
Right.
it's almost like we think of sin as like a list. And I just don't see that as helpful. And in the book, I don't come up with a definition. In fact, ironically, I use a Calvinist, Platinga, his definition, where it's like the subversion of God's shalom.
Oh,
So sin,
subversion of God's peace. Okay.
God's peace, God's shalom,
Right.
like,
Right.
and so I take that to mean more like, okay, so it's less about the specific thou shalt nots, and
Hmm.
more about, are you falling short of love God and love your neighbor? And that includes love your planet. That includes love your community. If you're subverting that, if you're actively harming that, that's what I think of as sin.
Right.
And obviously, I try to dispel the notion, which I'm not the first to debunk Augustine's notion of original sin, by no means, but I make sure to mention that a lot of, and we do this especially in evangelicalism, we act as if Calvin, or we act as if Augustine walked with Jesus himself.
Right.
Uh, and so a lot of our theology goes back to folks like that. I mean, mainly Augustine, if you're a little more savvy, but a lot of Calvin, if you're not as savvy. And it's just like we have these, again, you mentioned Western sort of presuppositions, where that's not necessarily the context uh, from which any of this comes from. And so I try to give a different, an alternative view on sin, to to point out that it's not that universalists or progressives such as myself take it lightly. It's just to say that sin doesn't get the last word. Sin doesn't have the last laugh in our theology, in our eschatology. In the evangelical model, they elevate sin so much. It's almost like they elevate, like the effects of sin outweigh the salvific act of Christ. Whereas I'm saying, no, just because we say that God or love wins in the end doesn't mean we lessen the gravity of sin. And so
Right.
I try to just put it back in its proper place. It's like, we don't have this totally depraved sin nature. It's more Jewish, where we have the two Yetzers, the impulse to do the good and the
Right.
impulse to do the bad, the two angels on the shoulder. Or, of course, I'm a Tolkien nerd, so Frodo struggling with the ring and with his own will, and that's more accurate
Right.
to our nature rather than we are worms, we're wretched, we're depraved.
Right.
Like
Right.
I don't like. So I start with like, let's get rid of that notion first, and then we can
No,
have a discussion about what sin might
yeah,
be.
well, that's a good place to start because we were just taught this notion of original sin or original depravity as if it was all true and it's all in the Bible, and so someone will pick out verses that seem to match that, and
Mhm.
etc. One of the things that helped me was when I realized, studying Christian history, that the Eastern Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, they don't have the same view of original sin,
No.
original depravity. It's more like what you just described, right? And there's kind of a tension there between, well, are we, we have a propensity to sin, but we also have, according to Genesis, we also have the image of God. And
Right.
so you're born with that image. And I think you're right. The evangelicals just so overblow the sin part and they kind of ignore the image of God part. And they put sin, as like you said, like as if it's a list of, we can't tell what sin is unless we get the list and know what the list is. And then we just following off the list and wondering, have I sinned now?
Well, and they
Yeah.
say the list is like all sins are weighted equal, but then in practicality, it's not, because they
It's
emphasize certain sins. Like we had,
yeah,
I forget who is on who pointed it out on Heretic Happy Hour, but it's the fact that there's like the sin of Jezebel, the Jezebel spirit. Like that's the
right.
like it's only women get this specific sin named after someone. So it's like in the church we focus on those sins, purity culture, which I get into in the book. The sin of being gay, that's one of the biggest
Yes, that's a
abominations.
big
Like
one.
we talk
Yep.
about that way more than they talk about adultery or jealousy or gossiping or
Yeah.
violence.
Right.
So even in their unweighted list, they certainly seem to weight them heavily and others not so heavily.
Oh yeah, I mean they do, and I mean that's the thing is that they end up saying things that really aren't there in the scriptures. To me, I mean it's like, okay, all of a sudden homosexuality is a worse sin than than whatever, and then you know uh, uh, all of a sudden, because you're sinning in a certain way, you're demonically influenced or whatever. I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
it gets crazy. But I think the other point that you make is very important. It doesn't mean that sin isn't a problem. It just means that everyone sins. No one's perfect. We have a propensity. We have the capacity to do ultimate very good things, and we have a capacity to do evil things. And we want to do the good, but we want to measure it right, because otherwise you just get into this sin management mentality where there's a sin under every rock,
Yep.
and
And a
you're
demon
walking
around
on
every corner.
and demon around every corner, and you're walking on
Yeah.
eggshells all the time. But if you
Yeah.
just put it like, look, am I trying to love today? Am I if is that my goal in my life, is trying to love people and not harm people, then I'm on the right path. But um and you mentioned purity culture. So that's a big sin in evangelicalism. What was your experience with it, and what have you written about it?
Well, I do talk about it for a chapter in this book. Um, I mean, I don't think and I don't remember having the actual term purity culture when I was in evangelicalism, although the markers are certainly there. And, if you go to like Linda K. Klein's book, Pure, she talks about like very specific, markers of what a purity culture church would look like, what that looks like. And we had all of those. I mean, there's emphasis on like a gender normative behavior, um, roles within the marriage, kind of hierarchical roles, heteronormativity for sure, emphasis on women's bodies and remaining pure in that way, an emphasis on to help control the uncontrollable men's mind.
Right.
So there's that link between what the woman wears, how the woman looks, and the behavior of the men in their lives. So those markers were there. The no sex before marriage, all those things were there, and I do get vulnerable about it. I talk about my wife and my relationship and how we worked out of that and what has been our struggles and what has worked for us, and try to give practical advice on people coming out of that, um, so that you can get to a place where you can finally have a vulnerable relationship and to differentiate and become who you are, who you're truly made to be,
Hmm.
rather than trying to fit within the emotionally fused sub Christian cultural standards that are placed upon you when that might not be who you are and likely most isn't. And while I say assuredly it harms women more, it stifles men as well, and it harms everybody. And
Yeah.
when a culture harms one part of it, it harms everybody.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, the it's true that we call it purity culture today, and back when I was a young evangelical, and as you said, they didn't call it that at
Yeah.
some point, uh, but it was there. It was always
Sure.
there. It
It's
was
always
not
there.
called
Yeah.
that, right? And there was I don't know. Josh Harris wrote this book called "I Kissed Dating Goodbye,"
Right.
and that came out, when
Which
I
I
was.
think he's, gone full circle now.
He
And
has.
yeah.
I've interviewed him. He's gone
Oh,
full
have you?
circle. Oh
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
yeah.
Okay, cool.
He wrote an article, said I kissed
I
dating
just
goodbye
yeah.
goodbye.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So, anyways, what I'm saying is that uh, there's a lot of trends in evangelicalism, and so all of a sudden, when back when I was starting off, they didn't have courting, the idea of courting, but they had very strict rules about dating, right?
Yeah. I
And then
hate
all of a
that word,
sudden,
by the way.
right, and then all of a sudden, courting was really in, and that's Josh Harris wrote that in his book, and all of
Uh-huh.
a sudden, right, not only could you not have sex before marriage, but heck, even if you kissed and made out before marriage, that might lead to sex, so you shouldn't have that either, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it pushed the limits. So Josh Harris was like, "I'm not kissing my wife until my wedding date." It was like, really?
Jeez, man.
It's like, and then so it got very, very legalistic,
Yeah, of course.
and then uh, I think that's probably part of it, is that you just get this. It's a mindset that you have. Oh, I've got to do it this way or else,
Or
and
else.
there's always an
Yeah.
or else. That's a danger. That's a bad thing.
Yep.
You're going to, for the woman, if she has sex or goes too far, she's damaged goods. For the man, there's guilt over just natural desires and masturbation. I mean, it's like
Yeah.
we were just inundated with these messages that really messed with us psychologically.
Right, and that's the thing, and again, going back to sin, these are the weighted sins, right? We talk
Right,
about them all the time, and I
right.
use these horrifying quotes at the start of each chapter. Well, yeah, women are described as a used lollipop wrapper. The chewed gum is another one.
Right,
April Joy talks about this a lot in Eve, on
right.
social media, and she does a lot of this kind of work. And just the things that are said to women, it's like you're obviously weighting the so-called sins very heavily now, even in your evangelical mindset. And so purity culture hammers home this idea on women especially hard.
Yeah, it does. And it is psychologically damaging, and I think if you
Yeah,
step back and just say, "Okay, look, let love be your guidepost.
yeah,
Don't harm people, treat people kindly, respectfully, and let that be your guidepost," then you choose what your path is in your sexuality, as
mhm,
long as you fit that guidepost that you set for yourself, which is not legalistic, and you can um, decide for yourself what it is, because at the end of the day, right, a lot of these things are not even coming from scripture. They're just coming from maybe obsession.
Yeah, well, when it comes to sexuality, I think a lot of it comes from internal insecurities. So if
Yeah,
we hear the
right,
term homophobia and people say, "I'm not
right.
afraid of gay people." No one ever said homophobia is being afraid of gay people. Homophobia to me, as I guess for a lot of people, is the internal insecurity about who you might be if
Yeah,
you're not
right,
straight, if you're
right.
not this and that.
Yeah,
It's your own fears of, "Oh, maybe I'm bi, maybe I'm gender non-binary, maybe I'm gay." And as an LGBT person myself, who came out of the evangelical church, I can assure you that that is true for some people. You don't want anyone to know. You don't want anyone to sense it.
right.
Because you're so afraid of it for yourself that then you project out your
Yeah,
homophobia on others.
yeah. No, that's a good point. So, we mentioned women and the damage they have from purity culture, and you also talk about women in leadership, I believe, in your book, and
Mhm.
some of the things that you discovered about the misinformation and the misinterpretations we have about women in some kind of spiritual leadership. Talk to us about that.
Well, I felt I had to write a whole chapter on Paul, or because a lot of our anti-woman stuff, let's just be frank, comes from Paul, right? I mean, or at
Yeah.
least what's attributed to Paul.
Right.
I point out in the book, it's not really, I'm not a scholar, a Pauline scholar, so I'm not getting into whether he wrote everything in the New Testament that is attributed to him. I think he probably only wrote about 7 of the epistles that are that are attributed to him. But nevertheless, it's in the Bible. So there's a lot of anti-woman messaging in, his pastoral epistles especially. And so when we actually look at the contexts, we realize that he's not like making injunctions about all women all time. Otherwise, he's a hypocrite.
Right.
because because women were in his leadership. He sent Phoebe with his most important letter to Rome to read it. Like, you can't say women aren't supposed to speak up in church when he's sending a woman to read his most important letter to a church.
Right.
So something else has to be going on there. And when we understand the history, there were certain groups, men and women, in certain churches teaching things that were wrong and themselves being judgmental hypocrites. And so just because, let's say, Paul tells a woman or a group of women to sit down and shut up in that time frame does not mean that that should be how we structure spiritual leadership based on what your genitals are. And if you do use ancient writings to do that, you're way out of pocket. You're way out of turn. Like, you don't have like the spiritual formation to be making these decisions. You're just a part of a patriarchal culture at that point.
Right. Well, I think you hit on a couple things. One of the things I discovered was that we misread the Bible. We often misread Paul. I mean,
Sure.
um, like
I
you
agree with
said,
that.
uh, I think there's only 7 letters that that the majority, the overwhelming majority, except for evangelicals, they're right, of serious biblical scholars only think that Paul wrote 7 letters, and I think there's 2 or 3 that are disputed,
Right.
and then there's like first the Timothy Titus series that
Mhm.
are, and then there might be one other one that that everyone thinks no, Paul didn't really write those, right? And
Right.
so you get, okay, well, what's the real Paul and what's the pseudo Paul, right?
Right.
And then you have the issue of those passages where it says, women should be silent in church. Well, one of those passages is in one of the Timothy books. And
Mhm.
so that's probably not even Paul writing. And then you've got the other one in one of the Corinthians that most scholars will say, hey, you know what? That is that there's 2 competing theories on that. There's evidence that it was actually a copyist's insertion into the book, and then another theory was that there's evidence that at least in some manuscripts, it was written by Paul as a like what his enemies or his
Yeah.
opponents would say, right?
That's
And
a
then he
yeah, that's
says,
a yeah, that's a
right,
theory I
and then he
think that yeah.
says in Anne Nyland's New Testament, she has she has right after that he says that the word basically the word bullshit, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
basically, some people say this bullshit, and then it's like he's actually making an argument that that's bullshit that women can't speak in the church. So
Right.
we have to get our texts right, or our source right, before we even have a conversation about this topic.
Yeah, and like I'm glad you pointed out that yeah, we just even if it's Paul, we read Paul incorrectly. Like we read Paul as if you read the letter and everything said in there is what Paul thinks. And we pretty much know at this point, like especially in Romans and Lucy
Yeah.
Pepiot argues in Corinthians. And let's just be honest, in Corinthians, we don't have First Corinthians or the rebuttal from the Corinth church. We have First Corinthians, which is Paul's second letter in the series. So
Yeah.
this is a back and forth dialogue we know already. And in
Right.
Romans, there's back and forth dialogue. We know that. Like he's having a discussion with false gospel teachers in Rome or on their way to Rome, teaching a certain gospel that he didn't agree with. We have evidence of that in Galatians when he's talking about this stuff. So Paul does have this argument back and forth. We can't pluck verses here and there. Well, we do. And we always do it because you can make the Bible say whatever you want.
Right.
So we silence women by doing that, even though ironically, or just like we silence, Romans 1:18 through 32, we silence gay people. And I think it's so ironic because that's really the voice of the false teacher that Paul refutes. So go ahead, Calvinists, have at it.
No, it's true. It's remarkable when you get yourself out of that mindset that, okay, I actually can question this and have some legitimate questions and look at what scholarship says about these texts and the culture, etc. And then you start to say, okay, there's more to it than what we're reading. And
Sure.
there are mistranslations in our modern English Bibles. There's a passage that says that a woman named Junia was among the apostles, and they changed it to Junius or something to
To
be a
make her a man.
man's name.
Yeah. Yeah. Shady.
And there are some of the church fathers who commented on that and said, "Oh, how wonderful a woman that person would have been to be considered an apostle." And it was like, so we have historical evidence that there were women apostles. So, but
Yeah,
that's ignored. That's ignored.
totally. Because
So,
it doesn't fit. Again, presuppositional. The men are in charge. It's all
right,
put that at the head, and then make everything fit inside
right,
of that worldview.
right. By the way, did you hear what Rick Warren concluded?
No, I'm dying to know.
Well, this is actually good news. This was like a year and a half ago. Rick Warren um, came out and said, "Okay, I'm going to start ordaining women to be pastors." And
Okay.
of course, the Southern Baptist denomination flipped out because that's what he was a part of. And he said, "Hey, you know what? I didn't look at this very carefully, but now that I've looked at it carefully, women can be leaders in the church. It's biblical, right?" And so he got kicked out of the Southern Baptists. And it's like it was remarkable because it's like, what? This is Rick Warren saying this.
Yeah.
But what was remarkable to me was like, Rick, do you just hear what you said? You just said for 40 years you preached the wrong thing, and now you finally looked into it and you're changing your mind.
Yeah.
And that's great. But you
That's
realize
great.
how problematic that is because you're still calling yourself an evangelical. Why don't you look more closely into the gay issue? Why don't you
Yeah, I was
look
just
more
about to say
closely
that.
into the doctrine of hell? Why don't you look more closely into these other things? You
That
know,
sounds like deconstruction, though, and that's
it
dangerous.
might be the first stage of Rick Warren's deconstruction. Who knows?
It it may be, as we say on Heretic Happy Hour, everyone is someone else's heretic.
Yeah, that's right. So, anyways, that was a fun fact. Um, Another thing that's really important is how do we raise our kids? And I was raised in, the church. I mean, the one of the first churches I went to was a People of Destiny church, which became Sovereign Grace Ministries, which was one of the leaders was Larry Tomzak. I don't know if you know that name,
Mhm.
but you were spared. But he wrote a book called God, the Rod, and Your Child's Bod.
Oh, gross. I hate that title so much. I hate it. Don't ever
And
call a child's body a bod. That's
it
no,
was
don't do
it
that.
was pretty bad. I mean, and and I was naive. My wife and I were young, newly married in the evangelical church, and so we were taught this stuff and started spanking our kids.
Sure.
And later on, we regretted it because we thought this is not a good way to raise your kids. But you have some things to say about that. What was that?
Well, it's for me, it's like, I mean, I have a background in social work and all of that. So there's part of my propensity to working with youth. And so I draw on those experiences. I feel like spanking and child rearing and things like that. Um, it needs to be one of those things where we really go to the science. Like
Hmm.
people of faith can be people of science. And I know that some evangelicals struggle with that. When I was younger, I struggled with that for a little bit. Um, and the science just tells us overwhelmingly that raising your children compassionately and non-violently sets them up much better than using any sort of corporal punitive systems that, I mean, the American Pediatrics Association, the Academy, the American Academy on Psychology. Um, I'm messing up the name of that, but I got it written in the book. I can't remember the exact
Right.
agencies, but they all come out against spanking. They all come out against
Yeah.
punitive parenting methods. But
Right.
old timey religion always has to go back to what, well, my parents did it this way, their grandparents did it this way, pass on these traditions. And it's like, no, instead, we need to take the approach of like, you stand on the shoulders of others. Like, my grandparents on my mother's side were way more punitive than my mother was. And I'm going to be way less punitive than she was. And I hope my daughter, if she has kids,
Right.
learns how to be more compassionate than I was. And that's
Yeah.
that's how science works. You stand on the shoulders of those who come before you. And so when it comes to parenting, we know a lot more now psychologically,
Hmm.
behaviorally than
Hmm.
our parents did, and they know more than their parents did. So let's keep going in that trajectory of being more compassionate and more uh in tune to our emotions, their emotions, what works, what doesn't work scientifically, rather than our, again, interpretation of the Bible or some misinterpretation of Proverbs.
No, that's a good point. I mean, the question is what works,
Yeah,
brings results, and uh, you know, mentally healthy children, right? And what
right.
causes psychological damage.
Yeah,
And so when you look at the science, they say, it's it's true that you spank your kids, and there's different levels of corporal punishment, from
sure.
beating the crap out of them to
Of
trying
course.
to say this hurts me more than you when
Sure.
you do it, right?
Sure.
But at the end, what you're communicating is the only way to change someone's behavior is through pain and punishment.
Right.
And this is the retributive mentality that our society has, not just Christians, but
Not just Christians,
retribution,
but
right?
yeah.
Retribution, punishment, pain, prison sentences. There's a whole thing you could go into, but just that's what changes society. That's the only way to correct society and correct wrongdoing, which is proven psychologically and scientifically and statistically to be wrong, that it actually doesn't. It actually backfires
Does,
and
yeah.
it causes problems down the road. So
Yes, statistically, it causes more kids to have trauma and to be themselves violent. And
yeah,
and again, people say, "Oh, I was spanked and I turned out fine." One retort I love is, "No, you argue for spanking." But the second, it's like, well, yeah, but that's like saying I did a bunch of cocaine as a kid and I turned out fine. Like,
yeah,
just
right,
because you
right,
turn
right.
out fine in spite of something, that's not how we do
It's not
science, right?
because of your spanking, it's in
Right.
spite of your
It's in
spanking.
spite of
Or
it.
if they're honest, I mean, like I was spanked when I was young, and my father whipped out the belt. And
Yeah,
if it's like looking back at that, it's like, you know what? That was psychologically harmful for me. I mean, I got
sure.
over it, but
Yeah,
it didn't help
yeah.
me,
No, no, and we know that. So
it put a barrier between me and my dad, because it was like
sure.
weird. It was just like, what the heck? So,
Yeah.
that's interesting to unpack that.
And I think a lot of it comes from our theology. Like, again, we're mimetic beings. If we have a more compassionate, more loving, more empathetic God in our worldview, we tend to be, disposed to that God. Or if we have a more wrathful, vengeful, retributive God, we tend to act like that God, and that will infuse into our relationships, whether they're with our kids, our spouses, our parents, our community. And I'll say one other thing about spanking. I don't understand how it's okay to spank children, but we couldn't do that to other adults. And that should cause us to pause right there. We can't work with
That's a great
elderly.
point.
And
Right.
I've worked with elderly folks. I've worked with people with dementia. People make the analogy it's like working with like a child sometimes.
Right, right.
You can't. It's a PS report right now. You start hitting them on the butt.
Yeah.
Why can you not? Why do we allow ourselves to argue? Well, we're going to do it to our most vulnerable, the actual
Right. That's
children.
an excellent point. We can't hit adults like that,
We
but we
can't.
can hit kids okay. I mean, it's like,
Right.
what
It's
sense does
it's
that make?
battery. It's literally battery. Like,
Right.
come on
Yeah.
now.
And speaking of retribution, what do you think why do you think Christians are wrong about the death penalty? I mean, that's in
Uh,
the Bible. It
it
says
is.
God
There's a lot.
ordered the death penalty.
There's a lot
So
of death in the Bible. Lots of death. I mean, even the donkeys and the kids are getting it.
right.
So yeah, I never care. Well, I care what's in the Bible historically and culturally and sometimes theologically. But there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that, again, we can make the Bible say whatever we want it to say. And again, the death penalty, we need to go with the science. It doesn't actually do anything. For one, in America, it's skewed toward racism. Shocking, um, that we end up putting to death black and brown folks at a higher rate than white folks.
Right.
Secondly, as we just saw recently, we put to death people who are likely innocent, and there's no coming back from that. Once you kill someone, you can't say, "Oh, we were wrong, bring them back." Um, and thirdly, it doesn't actually work. We know that restorative justice models in Europe work better than our retributive justice models in America.
Mhm.
Um, the land of the free somehow has 25% of the world's population, prison population, but only 5% of total population. There's something wrong
Yeah.
with that. And
Right.
so and so we can't be using an outdated model that scientifically has been shown to not actually benefit society. Um, and so even if your Bible says it, Jesus was put to death by the state, right? Like, we shouldn't be. It's weird to be in a religion where our guy is put to death by the state and then turn around and be for the mechanism that puts to death the guy that we follow.
Right. That's
That's weird.
true. Right. No, and it's all part of the retributive mindset that you get if you accept all of the Bible being true, and you accept all those verses that say God ordered this a capital punishment, and God ordered the Israelites to destroy and leave no survivors. during the Canaanite conquest, then you've got a stamp of approval on retributive uh, solutions, supposed solutions like the death penalty.
Yeah.
And to me, that's just totally contradictory to what Jesus taught. I mean, it's just like complete opposite.
Complete
And
opposite.
even Jesus did have one case where there was a death penalty, a capital punishment case brought to him, and he basically said, "No, do
Mhm.
not do that." So
Yeah.
that's very interesting to dig into that and realize that uh, people are not thinking these things through. They're just focusing on a retributive type of mentality that's embedded in our culture without thinking things through.
Yeah.
Um, one of the interesting things you dealt with in the book was talking about just revisiting, okay, illicit drugs, weed, smoking weed, right? Mind altering substances, right? Obviously, there are dangers to certain drugs.
Of course.
Certain drugs are very highly addictive
Yeah.
and very, very bad for you.
Sure.
Um, but on the other hand, we drink alcohol in our society. Okay, we know that
This is the
you can
spiritual brew pub, right?
this is a spiritual brew pub. You can have a beer, you can have a couple of craft beers, you can have 2 or 3 or 4 even.
Mhm.
But you gotta be responsible, right? You don't want to become an alcoholic. Well, is there a place? We have legal weed now all over. Christians are always been against um, controlled substances.
Mhm.
What's your view now of things like weed and other recreational drugs?
Well, I won't say that Christians have always been against controlled substances. I mean, there's certain types of Christians who are for sure. I think religions have been using mind controlled substance, quote unquote, controlled substances for a long time. There's even some evidence that cannabis is used in biblical cultures in the ancient Near East.
Hmm.
Whether it's mentioned directly in the Bible is up for debate, and I don't think there's any sort of consensus. In fact, I mean, I think like the fact that it is mentioned is more of an alternative theory. Um, I again, this I do get a little political in this chapter simply because the drug war doesn't work, right? We know that like
Right.
making things illegal doesn't work. And again, going back to the racism, it's super racist.
Yeah. Yep.
It's just another form of slavery. Like we had slavery, and then oh, we don't have slavery anymore, but we had Jim Crow. Oh, we don't have Jim Crow anymore, but we got the drug war.
Exactly. Right.
So it's like on and on. We just kick the can down the road.
Right.
We make it a little bit better for folks, but not really. Um, and so that we need to get out. Like that's
Well, there
whether
was
you whether
just interject one thing. It was okay. It was like the penalties for possessing cocaine were a lot less than the
a lot less.
penalties for possessing crack, and the crack was much more prevalent in the
Yep.
inner city and black
Yeah.
communities. But it was
Yeah.
the same drug, basically.
It's the same drug, but the white kids did coke and the
Right.
black kids did crack. So
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
obviously I'm stereotyping, but that was their mentality. So we
Right.
penalize the crack
Right.
more. Um, Again, a more subtle form of racism, but not so subtle.
Yeah.
Um, I, I say I say regardless of whether you use or not, we can't the right approach is not the criminal justice system. The right approach is medicinally and holistically, like what we do. Again, follow the science on by eliminating the drug war, we can actually study substances when they're
Right.
not schedule one drug. You can't study it. You can't get funding to study the effects of the
Right.
drug.
Right. Because it's
So
illegal. Right.
because it's
Yeah.
illegal, 100%
Right. Yeah.
top of the line.
Right.
So we have to study it and we have to go where the science goes and you have to go anecdotally. So if we find that cannabis is good for some folks, it might not be good for you. It might cause anxiety. It might cause some people use cannabis too much and they get this like vomiting syndrome.
Hmm.
There's just like with alcohol, like some people can have a beer and some people become an alcoholic. Some people can have uh certain foods and some people can't. They turn into whatever. And so what does Jesus say? It's not what enters the mouth, it's what comes out.
Yeah, right.
So the point being, like, it's not always what we consume or whether our meat is sacrificed to idols or not, as Paul would talk about. It's really the heart of the matter. It's who you are as a person. And I've found that allegedly I use cannabis and it has positive effects for me.
Yeah.
So that's for me. It might not be for you. The same thing with mushrooms. Like, we're finding that scientifically it can help with PTSD. It can help
Right.
with the guy who developed the 12-step program wanted LSD to be the last step to help
Yeah.
with alcoholism and addiction. So we can't just say because God made it that it's therefore good for our bodies, but we can say that there's some sort of use in everything that is here. So let's study it and figure out what is
Yeah,
good and
that
what
makes
is
sense.
uplifting and what is
What
not.
what's harmful and what's not, and what's
Exactly.
useful and what's not, right. And like
Exactly.
you said, it depends on the person. I mean, I used to smoke weed in high school and college, and then I g made me paranoid after a while because I think the stuff was getting so strong or something, I don't know.
Sure.
And
Maybe.
so but
Also,
there
our
was
brains aren't developed until they're 25. Like,
well, yeah, that's
you
true
might
too.
smoke weed when you're 18. You might smoke weed for the first time when you're 35. And I guarantee there's going to be two very different things when one brain is not literally not going to form for another 7 years fully.
Well, that's a good point too. Oh, maybe that means I should start smoking again.
I'm just trying to get you high. No, I'm playing.
So, but anyways, there was a time when I enjoyed it, but when it was like, milder, weed or whatever. But the point is that we've demonized things in our society. We've criminalized things and thinking this is the way to solve problems.
Right.
But this is not the way to solve problems because, yes, there are some drugs that are extremely dangerous and very highly addictive
Yeah.
that we need to guard against. But there are other drugs that actually have medicinal purposes that
Mhm.
can cause then help people, um, with ailments or just can be recreational or can be used in therapy, like you said. And that's something I'm learning in my program in non-religious spiritual direction is that there's been a lot of studies on mind altering drugs, mushrooms and LSD mostly, that under certain guidance and with a clinician can be used to help people overcome some issues in their life. So it's fascinating to study that, but just we need to be I think just we need to be open-minded about it.
We need to be open-minded. We need to be compassionate and empathetic. And
Yeah, right.
yeah.
So we're running out of time here, but there was one question I thought was really, really important is that, and this is something that, when you're an evangelical, you're taught to pray, okay?
Mhm.
And, it becomes very transactional, right? Okay, why is things not working in your life? You don't pray enough. Why
Yeah.
don't we have revival? We're not praying enough. Why? So what has changed in your view of prayer since you've deconstructed?
Oh, wow. Um, I that's a tough one because even when I was in evangelical, I wasn't sure how it worked. I wasn't sure it did work, and I
Yeah,
didn't
right.
notice it. I didn't see any, like,
Right.
I was an athlete growing up. When I practiced and practiced and practiced, I noticed a change. I would get better. I would get more adept at the craft. I never saw like a correlation between prayer and what happened.
Yeah. Right.
And so I've always kind of, I don't know if I had to deconstruct prayer in such a way because I don't know if I ever constructed a prayer. And I know some people
Okay.
do.
Right.
And so, some people have it so far where if we pray hard enough, the hurricane's going to miss this place and
Yeah.
not hit
Right.
that
Yeah.
place. And there's like
Right.
this.
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Oh my god, that creates the worst theodicy of all time. My head hurts." I thought we learned our lesson in the 1700s when hundreds of thousands of Christians who were praying on All Saints' Day died in an earthquake and subsequent tsunami. Um, so prayer can't work like that. I do gravitate toward potentially that, like, Tom Ord and Mark Karras and the open
Opening.
theology
Right.
guys and gals are on the right track that God can't. So there's if you had to limit one of the things, it's God's power.
Mm-hmm.
Like, God is certainly not a vending machine. God is certainly not transactional, as
Mm-hmm.
many would say he is. Like, there's not the quid pro quo in God. Um, if prayer does anything, it's to just reorient us to be more loving and to seek the good so that we become the answers to whatever prayer we're throwing up to God. To me, there's no such thing as prayer if you're not doing the thing you're praying for. Like, what are you doing? You're just mumbling to yourself. You're speaking in tongues in front of everyone so that it looks good. But I mean, it doesn't seem, I don't, where's the evidence that asking God for something happens other than outside of like capriciousness or coincidence? It's like the placebo effect. I asked God and then this happened. Yeah, but 200 times you asked God and it didn't happen. So maybe it was not a, maybe prayer, maybe if prayer works, it works a lot differently than that.
Right. No, that definitely related to everything you're saying.
I
I
don't have a
think
great answer though, because
for
it's one of those
me,
things
for
that
me,
gets tough.
the main thing is I realized that God is not transactional.
Yeah.
That was the biggest breakthrough for me because I was
Right.
always taught he was, right?
Right.
You know, you got to pray for things to happen, and then when you realize, no, wait a minute, God is, and then I think Tom Ward has really helped me, as you say, because um, now all of a sudden you realize God is really not all powerful because if he was, then the problem of evil is just too much in this world, right? And
Way
that's
too much.
a
Right.
whole nother road to go down. But
Yeah. Or
when
maybe
you,
power is defined wrongly.
yeah, well, as Tom Ward would say, he's not all powerful, but he's not impotent either. He's, you know,
Right.
there's things he can do, but there's a lot of things he can't do,
Right.
and that explains life, right?
Right.
So, but prayer definitely, it's a really interesting thing to deconstruct and try to rebuild something. But for me, it's like I don't really pray anymore like I used to. But
No.
on the other hand, I feel like I'm connecting maybe on a spiritual level more than I was before because I don't know how to explain it. It's just like just an attitude that you carry around. Like,
Yeah.
all right, but I love what you said about if you're gonna have a connection and you think prayer is important, then do the thing that you want to pray for
Yeah.
and make it something that helps you love other people better. So that's a great message. So one other question: we're coming up towards our election.
Oh God, help us.
Oh my gosh. Anyways, just I think you say something in the book about it. What do you say about Trumpism and Christianity?
Well, I didn't know what else to write about the topic, but I wanted to mention something. So I collected some open letters that I had written over before the book came out, and I had published them on my blog, and I wanted to include them in the book because they say, something about Christian nationalism that, I didn't have any other way to put it. I didn't need to put it in any way. And I had these letters sitting here,
Letters from
and
who?
myself,
Okay.
that I had written openly
Okay.
to Christian nationalists.
Oh, okay. All right.
Um, because I don't know how you can be a Christian nationalist. It's like like, I don't, that doesn't make sense to me, because Christianity and nationalism are paradoxical,
Right.
and not in the kind of paradoxical way that works.
No,
Like,
no, no. Right. Christianity is about universal love, not one country is better than another.
yeah. So I find the modern American evangelical church, if you're still in MAGA, you're still in Trumpism, I find to be the most repulsive version of the faith.
Yeah.
And even when I deconstructed, I had good reason to deconstruct, but I didn't see this coming.
Yeah.
We
Right.
saw glimpses, we saw things,
Yeah.
but like
Right. We
it's
didn't.
gone
Yeah.
so far
It's
that
amazing.
I don't know. I don't know a lot of things. I don't know how they come back from this. I don't know how the faith. I don't know. They have no testimony. They have nothing to stand on.
No,
Like it's
it's a cosmic shift. I mean, it's just like
totally,
they've gone so far down this path
yeah.
that you're right. There's no turning back. I think it has to be another form of it has to rise up, or it'll just maybe people will actually all become mystics like we're supposed to. But
Well, eventually, right? Isn't that the quote? Like
right.
the modern Christian will be a mystic or nothing at all. I forget who said that.
Exactly. Yeah, I can't remember who said that, but I saw him speak at the Wild Goose Festival.
Oh,
So,
good.
all right, this has been a great conversation, Matthew. So much for joining us. What matters most and now in your faith? What are you focused on?
Oh, I don't know if faith is the right word.
What
Um,
matters most in your life?
yeah. My daughter, my wife, my community. I think justice, liberation,
Yeah.
having a having true community, like in your, it doesn't have to be a church, just like in your neighborhood, like
Hmm.
just locality. And a big one is the planet and ecology. I am starting a farm. I'm terrified about climate change. I think we've scapegoated the planet long enough. So it's very important for me that we find some ecological justice. And Christians should understand this first and foremost because they have Genesis. Read Genesis 1.
Yeah. Be stewards of the earth. Right.
Be stewards, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, folks, we've run out of time. Thank you, Matthew, for joining us. Where can people find
Thank
your
you.
book? Obviously on Amazon. Do you have a website?
Yeah, well, I have go to choir.com. That's my
Choir.
publishing company's website.
Yep.
All of our books are on there. I got it right here. Heretic Too. I'll give you the link and you can
We'll
hopefully
put that in
share
the
it.
show notes.
Yeah,
By
I
the
hope everyone
way,
buys it. Yeah,
Matthew and Keith Giles are my publishers,
we are
publishing the book right behind me here.
right behind you. I see it right there.
Yeah, right.
One
So
of one
great.
of Raphael's last covers that he
That's
did.
right. I got maybe the last one from Raphael. That
Well,
was a
no,
privilege, right?
this was
That is?
Raphael.
Okay. All right. All right.
We do get some special treatment from
You
him,
get
but
special. All right. If you can go back to Raphael if you need to. Is that
if
what
I
you're saying?
if I need to, yeah.
Okay, I got you. Well, I'll keep that in mind for my next book that I'm writing. All
Oh
right.
yeah, he might make you pay though.
Okay.
You might have to pay
Okay.
him.
Well, he's good. He's worth it. So,
Yeah, he
all
is
right.
good.
Well, thanks for joining us,
Yeah,
Matthew.
thanks for
And
having me.
folks, pick up Matthew's newest Heretic book, Heretic Too. It's available on Amazon, and you can find it in the show notes. We'll put the website in
Yeah,
thechoir.com
and
where you can find the book.
make sure you know that Larry R on the front cover says it's a load of BS. So
Oh, well, Larry R. Right.
Larry R,
Larry
great
R.
reviews already coming through.
Got a great review. It's a bunch of bullshit, but that means it's a good book. So that's in heretic terms, that's good, right?
I agree.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. And until next time on the Spiritual Brew Pub, enjoy responsibly.